Hey everybody, I'm back to tell you about the presidential election of 1804. This was an interesting election because of presidential elections that were contested. This is one of the few where it was clear throughout the campaign who the winner was going to be. This election, which was the fifth U.S. presidential election, was the first in which presidential electors distinguished between casting electoral votes for president and for vice president, which eliminated the possibility of the presidential and vice presidential candidates ending in a tie as they had in the election before this. This was also the second U.S. presidential election out of 6 consecutive ones in which a Virginia plantation owner was elected president. So let's get into this. This presentation will probably be a little bit shorter because fewer things of interest happened during this the campaign of 1804, because in general the Federalists had lost a lot of their leadership and just didn't put in the effort this time, and as a result they were defeated pretty handily. So let's get into it. Jefferson's first 2 years were a dramatic break with what had happened before. He wanted to greatly reduce the federal budget. And so this person shown here, Albert Gallatin, became the new Secretary of the Treasury, and he met with Thomas Jefferson on multiple occasions to come up with a plan to reduce the federal budget, and with the hopes that they would be able to pay off the federal deficit, the accumulated, the total debt of the U.S. government in 10 years, which didn't happen because of other things that came up. So what they did was, in 1801, they were able to cut the budget by 30%. And here's how they did that. They reduced the number of federal employees. For example, James Madison, the new Secretary of State, only had 6 people working for him. They were called clerks. And on occasion after this, the person who held the position of chief clerk, who is like the undersecretary of state, plays a role of some importance. And so those people will be mentioned from time to time. Henry Dearborn becomes the new Secretary of War. And as you remember, Adams had this temporary army for defending the United States in case of a war against France, but they had been disbanded and sent home. And Dearborn reduced what was left of the army by 50%. And the new Secretary of the Navy, who was named Robert Smith, I had intended to have his name there, reduced the Navy by 65%. Now, Jefferson wanted to eliminate the U.S. Navy altogether. But the Barbary pirates were a group of people who operated out of Libya, and they had wanted the United States to give them a bribe not to attack U.S. shipping in the Mediterranean, and John Adams had refused, as he had refused the bribe that was demanded by the French government. So the Barbary pirates in the beginning of 1801 declared war on the United States, which is sort of strange because they weren't really a country. So the reason that the Navy wasn't abolished altogether was that what was left of the Navy was sent to tame the Barbary pirates, which they did fairly easily. For people who are interested in national security, this is a big deal to reduce the federal military like this. Now, if you recall at the time, the purpose of the United States Army was to be like an initial force that would stop a foreign invasion, because the states would call up their militia when needed. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is Jefferson was able to do this because of what happened under the Washington and Adams administration, specifically the treaties, the Jay Treaty, and which got the British troops off of U.S. soil, and the Pinckney Treaty with Spain, which resolved the territorial boundary between the U.S. and Florida. So the United States was not in danger of an invasion, especially because the French had been sort of working with Thomas Jefferson, who was conducting his own foreign policy while he was vice president. So the United States was not going to be invaded, and it just happened to work out. This becomes a little bit of an issue when the War of 1812 starts, because the Army hasn't really been maintained and trained. So the United States starts off sort of on the wrong foot. Okay, well, anyway, two things with foreign policy that happened during Jefferson's first 2 years are the Barbary Pirates, which I mentioned, and the Louisiana Purchase. Let's go to the next slide. Jefferson heard that Spain had given this territory in the brown color to France as a part of their negotiations when France defeated Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, with the idea being that France would be able to work on a new empire in the New World. But then Toussaint Louverture, that we mentioned last time, declared his independence from France. And while that was happening, the port officials in New Orleans had not been open to allowing free access to New Orleans markets by Americans who lived mainly along the Ohio River. So Jefferson sent two people, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, to France to try to work out a deal where the United States would buy New Orleans. That's really all they were authorized to do. But Napoleon decided he needed money more than he needed a North American empire. So they worked out a deal where the United States would purchase this tract of land for $15 million. This is one of the things that defeated Jefferson's attempt to balance the budget. I mean, to obliterate the federal debt in 10 years, because $15 million was a lot of money. And of course, the only reason he was able to do that, since the United States didn't have $15 million, is because he could get money from the Bank of the United States that had been set up by the Federalists. So the big accomplishments of Jefferson's administration wouldn't have happened without the Federalists doing what they had done when George Washington and John Adams had been president. Jefferson then entered into negotiations to buy Florida, which was still owned by Spain. And that never really came to fruition. But again, that's another thing that would have stopped, and that happened in Jefferson's second term. But that's another thing that would have postponed this whole idea of obliteration of the federal debt. But the purchase was really popular, and in the Senate, it was ratified by a vote of 24-7. So even some of the Federalists voted for this. So in the midterm elections, something of interest happened. One thing was that the number of seats in the U.S. House was increased. This is a map that shows the relative sizes of the states after this apportionment. The blue states are the largest 5. The green states are the next 5, and the yellow ones are the remaining states. So in the midterm elections, the result was Democratic Republicans 25 in the Senate and 9 Federalists. This is an increase by the Democratic Republicans of 6 seats in the Senate. So they almost cut the Federalists in half in the Senate. In the U.S. House, you can see is 103 to 39. One thing that's kind of interesting about that is if you only look at the seats that were continuing from the previous Congress, the Federalists actually gained 1. What caused this supermajority for the Democratic Republicans was the fact that they picked up almost all of the new seats that were added. They gained 35 seats of the new seats that were created as a result of the reapportionment. And a few things happened under the new Congress of note. Ohio was admitted as the 17th state. That was not done the way it should have been done, actually. Ohio was not officially declared a state. Congress just seated the people who had been sent as senators and representatives. And it was actually a century later for Ohio's centennial as a state that they realized the problem and declared Ohio to be a state, but nobody seemed to care at the time. Nobody challenged it. Another thing that happened, now that the Democratic Republicans had these supermajorities, Jefferson and his party started to go after Federalist office holders. And as a test case, they chose Samuel Chase. Now, Chase was a member of the Supreme Court. He was an associate justice. And he had said some things critical of Thomas Jefferson. It's kind of funny. One of the reasons that it was necessary for them to pursue impeachment against him was because the party had allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts, specifically the Sedition Act, to lapse. They really didn't need it anymore because it was not the Federalist press that was publishing stories that were just totally false. That was the Democratic Republican press that was publishing tabloid stories. And since they supported Thomas Jefferson, there was no reason for the law anymore. It could have been used against Samuel Chase, but they decided to impeach him instead. And this kind of sets up some issues about, okay, impeachment is mentioned in the Constitution, sort of vague. So the Senate had to figure out what is the process of impeachment. And they laid out the process that's still used today. And we'll get to his impeachment a little bit later. Last is the 12th Amendment. And one thing about the 12th Amendment is this was originally proposed during the Adams administration to separate the votes for president and vice president. A Federalist from South Carolina originally introduced this. It was known at the time as the Discrimination Amendment because they wanted to discriminate between electoral votes for president and vice president. Because of partisan politics, neither side had the necessary supermajority to get it passed. But then after the midterm election, the Democratic Republicans did. So it was approved by Congress in late 1803, not long after they gathered and sent to the states. North Carolina's legislature was in session and ratified it pretty quickly. So by the next summer, because it was officially declared to be ratified on June 15, The states here in pink are the ones that ratified it. Massachusetts did later. Connecticut and Delaware apparently never did. This was taking place while the parties were trying to decide who their candidates would be for president and vice president, and entered a little bit into the their plans for the election. One thing I forgot to mention was in the U.S. House, when this came to a vote, it actually was one vote short of a majority. And in case you don't know, usually the Speaker of the House does not vote. And Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina, who was Speaker of the House, did vote on that one occasion to put the 12th Amendment over the supermajority status that was required. That happened later. Schuyler Colfax did that with one of the Reconstruction Amendments. Okay, so now, in early 1804, it was time to sort of figure out what are we going to do. Members of Congress, when they gather, they like to do this while Congress was in session, which is why it took place at this time. So members of Congress who are Federalists gathered for George Washington's birthday in 1804, and they discussed who they might support. And they decided to go with Charles C. Pinckney, who had been a candidate in 1800, and Senator Rufus King of New York State. So this was going to be their ticket. Pinckney, an interesting little story. The year before, in 1803, he had traveled through New England, spoke with Federalist leaders in various places. And while he had been traveling with a woman that he held in bondage, a black woman. And he had a lot of stuff in his carriage, and so she would walk along behind him on the road wherever he traveled. Because roads weren't very good, and the carriage didn't move that fast. So she could keep up with no problem. But one time, she decided to make a run for it, and he had to get people to chase her down, which they did. So he went to a blacksmith and had this collar made to go around her neck, so that when he was traveling, they would attach a chain to that collar, and she would walk along behind his carriage, attached to it by this chain. And people in New England were just horrified. They had never seen this before. They didn't have a lot of black people in New England, and New England was already turning against the idea of slavery. And they really did not like this. And this is one of the things that helps to explain what's getting ready to happen when people go to vote in 1804. Okay, so that's the Federalists. 3 days later, the Democratic Republicans in Congress met for their caucus. Everybody was for Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson did not want to keep Aron Burr as vice president. Burr and Jefferson really didn't get along after the contingent election. But Burr had continued to preside over the Senate. And members of the House from Virginia spoke with people from New York. You have to wonder, why were they so concerned about New York? Because Pennsylvania and Massachusetts were comparable in size to New York. Why didn't they pick somebody from Pennsylvania to be vice president? For whatever reason, they wanted somebody from New York. And they decided to go with George Clinton. Now, he was a very controversial person, as we've covered before, and a lot of people did not want him to be vice president. So they actually took a vote at the caucus. Who do we want? And this man on the right here, John Breckinridge of Kentucky, was offered as an alternate. And of course, Breckinridge had some things going for him that Clinton didn't have. He was much younger and he was more like mentally with it than George Clinton was. Breckinridge was later became Attorney General under Jefferson and is his grandson who becomes Vice President under James Buchanan. But Clinton won that nomination 67-41. So here we have the Democratic Republican ticket. Jefferson for president, Clinton for vice president. Remember, at this point, the 12th Amendment had not been adopted. So they are both running for president at this point. At the end of the caucus, before they left, they appointed a committee to work with presidential electors in case the discrimination amendment was not approved in time to be used in the election. Okay. It's pretty easy to assume that Aron Burr would be unhappy about this. He just gets dumped without anybody even talking with him about it. So he decided, okay, George Clinton's term as governor of New York is up. So Aron Burr ran to take his seat. Now, Aron Burr was still serving as vice president, but he ran for governor. And this kind of upset the apple cart a little in New York State. The Democratic-Republican Party had really 3 factions at that point. And some of them, this caused just a lot of turmoil in the whole political situation. So Morgan Lewis was his opponent. Some Federalists supported Morgan Lewis. Some Democratic Republicans, the Clintonians, supported Morgan Lewis. The people who would eventually become the Bucktails supported Aron Burr. And Morgan Lewis won that race with 42%, April 25, 1804. As a result of this campaign and things that had been said, the Hamilton-Burr duel takes place in which Burr shot Hamilton and killed him on July 11. Having duels have consequences because in New York State, it was against the law. It wasn't in New Jersey. Although New Jersey passed a law after this to make it illegal. But an arrest warrant was issued for Aron Burr, and they weren't able, it's kind of crazy to say this, they weren't able to catch him because everybody knew where he was. He was in Washington, D.C. presiding over the Senate when it was in session. So they could have caught him if they wanted to. Okay. One of the things the Federalists had in mind in terms of winning this election was that if they could carry certain states, they might be able to sort of influence the election. Maybe some of them would vote for Clinton in addition to Pinckney, which would make George Clinton president, which terrible idea on their part to try to game a system like that. But once the 12th Amendment passed, the Federalists realized that they really had no chance of winning this. And so they really ran a minimal campaign. They did have some newspapers that supported them, and they ran slates of presidential electors in various states, as we'll see. But they didn't put up much of an effort. Now let's look at the states, sort of the status. What was the strategy of the two parties? Well, Jefferson was guaranteed 11 states because he was just so far ahead, or the Federalists didn't even run an opposition slate of presidential electors, or it was a very weak one. Those 11 states were allotted 101 electoral votes, which is already a majority because 89 was a majority. So everybody knew Jefferson was going to win this. The Federalists could pretty much count on Connecticut and Delaware because of the presidential electors were chosen by the legislature, which was controlled by the Federalists in both cases. So this leaves 4 states with popular elections where the campaign happened to be waged. Now, you can see in looking at this that 2 of these are in New England. So the Jeffersonians are carrying this battle straight into the heart of the Federalist Party. 2 of them, Maryland and North Carolina, the Federalists weren't really contesting the entire state. Both of these states were electing presidential electors by district, but the Federalists were trying to win certain districts, which I think the next slide, yes, shows. This slide shows a number of things. On the map, states in green elected presidential electors statewide. So people would go to the polls and, for example, if Rhode Island had 4 electoral votes, every voter got to cast votes for 4 people to cast those electoral votes. This was, as you know, was called at the time the general ticket. So the states in green used the general ticket statewide election of all of the presidential electors for that state. States in blue elected presidential electors by districts. And again, the way this worked is at the end of election day, the results of each county were handed to the county sheriff. And all of the sheriffs in a given electoral district, which were not the same as congressional districts, would meet together. A few days later, they would tabulate who had won and send that information to the governor. So in 3 states that happened. The red states chose presidential electors through the legislature. On the left, you can see the days where various states voted, and I don't have the days of 4 of the states. You would think people would have looked this up by now, but I couldn't find, even in newspapers.com, when those states voted. Okay. The numbers here are important. The numbers on the map show the percentage of the vote given to Thomas Jefferson. And in New England, he got 52%, in New Hampshire, 53%, in Massachusetts. Just an unbelievable result that would have happened. The Federalists were just shocked that they actually lost those 2 states. In North Carolina, something unusual happened, which was in 3 of the electoral districts, 1 sheriff in each of those districts failed to show up to canvass the vote. That's usually not a big issue. It happened to be an issue this time because Federalist candidates for presidential elector carried 2 electoral districts, but they weren't certified as the winner because the sheriff of 1 Federalist county in each case didn't show up for the canvass. So a Jefferson presidential elector was declared to be the winner. This was a real problem, and the state legislature passed a law that would fine sheriffs for not showing up to do this. The effect, though, of what they did was to steal 2 electoral votes from Pinckney and give them to Jefferson. Now, this is a table that shows the results of the popular vote. Again, as you know, when people showed up to vote, they didn't look at a ballot and see Thomas Jefferson's name beside Charles Pinckney's name. They showed up to vote and they cast votes for these people running for presidential elector. One of these people running for presidential elector in Ohio was named John Bigger. And John Bigger was somebody who did not trust George Clinton. And so he said he was running to support Thomas Jefferson for president and Robert Livingston for vice president, another person from New York State. He didn't get many votes. Most people include his totals with Jefferson's main total. They really should be kept separately because he had a different vice presidential candidate he supported. This is something that happened from time to time in American history. The two, I guess, most memorable times were 1832, when a Southern Democratic group did not want Martin Van Buren to be the vice presidential candidate. And then in 1896, when William Jennings Bryan had two different vice presidential candidates running with him. Well, Jefferson gets roughly 73% of the popular vote. That gave him 108 presidential electors and Pinckney 2, which should have been 106 to 4. Then legislatures appointed 54 for Jefferson and 12 for Pinckney. So you can see this is going to be a real blowout. In the meantime, states are voting for the U.S. House in the fall of 1804. And the result of these elections, the Democratic Republicans won 89 seats, the Federalists won 27. So the Democratic Republicans picked up a net of 7 because the Federalists gained the 1 seat in Delaware and they gained 1 seat in Pennsylvania. That left 24 seats in Virginia and Tennessee that would be elected in early 1805. At this point, late 1804, they had 20 Democratic Republicans and 4 Federalists holding those seats. Now, presidential electors gathered to cast their electoral vote on December 5. The map here really illustrates how poorly the Federalists did. The only thing that they gained past the 2 states that they had locked in were these 2 electoral votes in Maryland. And for the first time, the presidential electors vote first for president for Thomas Jefferson, then for vice president for George Clinton, both of them winning 162 to 14. So presidential electors mail their results to the office of vice president and send one person to Washington, D.C. as a messenger. And these 2 are supposed to have the same information to be verifiable. So at the joint session of Congress, February 13, 1805, Aron Burr is still there and he presided over that. And they read all the certificates of vote, and Aron Burr declared the 2 winners. One thing that's kind of funny is that after he declared the winners, he announced the day that would be Inauguration Day, and he actually announced the wrong day. He said the inauguration would be on March 3 and not on March 4. Really small footnote in history. It's irrelevant, but interesting. Right after that, the Senate went into their impeachment trial for Samuel Chase. This is an important case for a number of reasons, but even though the impeachment failed, the Democratic Republicans had the vote if it was going to be a party line vote. But one of the things that happened that we don't think about today because we expect it to be the way it is now. William Rehnquist wrote about this. He wrote a book about impeachments. And he said that one thing that happened was before this impeachment trial, that members of the Supreme Court would comment about what was happening in politics. after this, they decided they had to be apolitical. They had to be above politics, not weigh in about what was happening around them, which was a very good thing, obviously. So Aron Burr presided over the trial, and a lot of people complained at the time, here's a guy, there's a warrant out for his arrest, but he's up there presiding over a trial of somebody else. On March the 2nd, 1805, he gave a farewell address to the U.S. Senate and left town. He didn't want to be around for the inauguration. And we often think that, I don't know, politicians have like some obligation to be there to see other people inaugurated. Maybe it's a moral obligation, not necessarily a legal obligation. Like John Adams apparently missed George Washington's second inauguration. Primary sources, some say he was there, some say he was not there. He definitely did not attend Jefferson's inauguration. So Burr left and did not attend the inauguration, which was 2 days later, March the 5th, 1805. Something interesting that happened that year for the first time, but becomes standard after this, but ends after the inauguration in 1920. In 1933, this ends. Congress was scheduled to be in session, theoretically, until noon on March 4. They didn't always do that. It was a little bit sporadic, but sometimes they had legislation that was in the process, or somebody wanted to give a speech or something. This was the first time it happened on Inauguration Day. Congress was in session until noon in 1805. Now, this was the last day of their session, so they're trying to do stuff before the new members of Congress come in. Now, often after this, if they didn't finish up by noon, they would have somebody to go. Both the House and the Senate had a clock on the wall, and they would send somebody to go to that clock and turn the hands back to give them a little bit more time. And people who were there for the inauguration commented about that because they hated it. They didn't care about these debates that were happening that for most of the public weren't nearly as important as the inauguration was. They weren't there for the debate. They were there for the inauguration, which was often delayed, sometimes up to an hour, because somebody had the floor in the House or the Senate and wanted to get in their words before the end of that Congress. I don't know about if turning the hands back happened in 1805. That did happen a lot after that. So the 8th Congress officially concluded at noon, and it was done. At that point, Thomas Jefferson gave his second inaugural address, and then John Marshall, the Chief Justice, administered the oath first to Thomas Jefferson and then to George Clinton. Now, most of the time during the early years of the Republic, the Vice President was inaugurated first. And another thing unusual about this is newspapers didn't carry much information about the inauguration. Very minimal. I mean, usually they go into like who came in first, what they were wearing, just all kinds of interesting details. I mean, not super pertinent, but just to give a flavor of what was happening that day. They did not. The only detail of interest for 1805 is they specifically say that John Marshall administered the oath first to Jefferson and then to George Clinton. Now, this was the first time the Chief Justice had administered the oath to the incoming Vice President. Before that, it had been the President pro tem of the Senate. So, now we have our new team in office. Thomas Jefferson is the new president, and George Clinton is the new vice president. So that's the end of this presentation. If you found this sort of interest or helpful, I'd be glad if you would give me a like. Leave a comment if you have any questions. I did have a question last time, which somebody sent me privately rather than through YouTube. But thanks so much. I really appreciate that you came and watched my video, and have a great day.